For Katie, the decision to keep the name Logan had never been about nostalgia or provocation, though others insisted on interpreting it that way. It was a declaration shaped by years of standing in the shadow of louder voices, stronger personalities, and inherited expectations that had always threatened to define her before she could define herself. The name, once a shared symbol of family unity, had become for her a marker of survival, proof that she had endured loss, erasure, and reinvention without dissolving into someone else's narrative. To relinquish it now, under pressure or compromise, would feel like surrendering the last territory she fully controlled. Katie did not see herself as stealing anything, she saw herself as refusing to disappear. Brooke, however, experienced the same choice as an unforgivable violation. To her, Logan was not merely a surname, but a legacy shaped by sacrifice, resilience, and a lifetime of battles fought in public view. It carried the weight of generations, of triumphs earned through visibility and endurance, and she believed it demanded guardianship, not reinterpretation. Brooke did not frame her objection in terms of ownership, yet beneath her outrage lay a deep conviction that Katie's insistence diluted something sacred. What began as discomfort hardened into resentment, fueled by the fear that history was being rewritten without consent. Brooke felt displaced not by competition, but by the implication that her authority over the family story was no longer absolute. As the tension escalated, the conflict shed any remaining pretense of being a business disagreement. The branding debate became a moral standoff, each woman convinced that yielding would amount to self-annihilation. Every conversation, every public appearance, carried an undercurrent of accusation, their shared past looming between them like an unresolved trial. Katie's resolve sharpened in response to Brooke's opposition, transforming her quiet determination into something bordering on defiance. She told herself that strength meant standing alone, that independence required enduring misunderstanding without flinching. Yet beneath that resolve lay exhaustion, the kind that accumulates when pride becomes armor worn too long without rest. The launch event, meticulously planned as a moment of triumph, instead crystallized everything that had gone wrong. The venue glittered with polished surfaces and calculated optimism, designed to project confidence and inevitability. Cameras flashed, applause rippled through the crowd, and yet beneath the spectacle lurked an atmosphere charged with judgment. Journalists leaned forward not with curiosity, but with expectation, their questions sharpened by rumors and visible fractures. Katie felt the weight of their scrutiny like hands pressing against her chest, compressing her breath even as she forced herself to smile. Each inquiry carried a subtle accusation, a suggestion that her success was illegitimate, that her autonomy came at someone else's expense. As the spotlight intensified, Katie became acutely aware of her own body betraying her. Her heart began to falter, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a disorienting misalignment, as though its rhythm had slipped out of sync with the rest of her. The applause around her sounded distant, distorted, transformed into a hollow echo that underscored the artificiality of the moment. She stood upright, refusing to show weakness, clinging to posture as proof of resilience. This was the price of independence, she reminded herself, the cost of proving that she needed no protection, no validation, no permission. Brooke watched from within the same room, her fury gradually giving way to unease as she observed Katie's rigid composure. The satisfaction she had expected to feel at seeing her authority challenged gave way to something far more uncomfortable, the realization that this battle had crossed an invisible threshold. What she had framed as a necessary defensive legacy now appeared perilously close to cruelty. The audience's applause, once a familiar source of affirmation, took on a hollow quality, as if the celebration itself were complicit in something irreparable. Brooke recognized, too late, the fragility beneath Katie's defiance, the way her independence was being tested not just emotionally, but physically. The moment of collapse did not arrive with spectacle, but with inevitability. Katie's body, pushed beyond its capacity to endure symbolic warfare, began to fail her in ways she could no longer conceal. The tightening in her chest intensified, radiating outward until the room itself seemed to tilt. The carefully constructed image of victory fractured, revealing the cost beneath it. The applause faltered, replaced by confusion, then alarm, as observers realized that the performance of strength had demanded more than she could give. In that instant, the name Logan, the branding war, the legacy dispute all shrank in significance, dwarfed by the undeniable reality of mortality asserting itself. As Katie faltered, the irony of her triumph became painfully clear. She had stood her ground, defended her right to exist independently, and refused to yield to familial pressure. Yet the victory, she claimed, was inseparable from the damage it inflicted. The declaration of self-reliance, meant to affirm life on her own terms, now threatened to shorten it. The realization struck with brutal clarity: independence, pursued without mercy, could become indistinguishable from self-destruction. Katie's insistence on proving she needed no one had left her isolated at the very moment she most needed connection. In the aftermath, the room bore witness not just to a medical emergency, but to the collapse of illusions both women had sustained. Brooke was forced to confront the possibility that her defense of legacy had overshadowed her responsibility to protect the living embodiment of that legacy. The family name, stripped of abstraction, revealed itself as powerless in the face of a failing heart. Katie, suspended between consciousness and surrender, became a symbol of the dangerous intersection between pride and vulnerability, where strength is measured not by endurance alone, but by the willingness to accept help. The conflict, once framed as a struggle over identity and ownership, emerged instead as a cautionary tale about the limits of autonomy when severed from compassion. The cost of the battle was etched not into contracts or headlines, but into the fragile rhythm of a heart pushed beyond endurance. In that reckoning, it became clear that no legacy, no name, and no declaration of independence could justify a victory purchased at the expense of life itself. The applause faded, the cameras turned away, and what remained was the stark understanding that some wars, once fought to the brink, leave no true winners, only survivors haunted by what they nearly lost. Katie's death did not arrive quietly, nor did it leave behind the stillness that grief is supposed to bring. It arrived as an ending that refused to stay private, a loss immediately claimed by public appetite rather than medical explanation. The official cause was precise and clinical, wrapped in language designed to close questions rather than invite them, but the world was uninterested in physiology. The world wanted intention. It wanted motive. It wanted someone to point to, someone whose name could absorb the weight of collective anger and unfinished sorrow. In the days following Katie's passing, the story of her heart was discarded in favor of the story of her conflict, and in that story, Brooke emerged not as a sister in mourning, but as a figure shaped conveniently into a villain. The narrative formed with ruthless efficiency. Headlines simplified what had been complex, compressing years of tension into a single, digestible accusation. The so-called war between Logan and Logan was framed as a slow-burning assault, an emotional siege that had culminated in collapse. Every disagreement was retroactively reinterpreted as a blow, every public disagreement recast as evidence of cruelty. The fact that Katie had insisted on standing alone, on fighting for her autonomy with relentless pride, was quietly erased. Independence made for a less compelling headline than persecution. And so the public consensus hardened around a singular conclusion: Brooke had pushed her sister too far. The machinery of outrage required fuel, and it found it quickly. Messages surfaced, stripped of context and arranged to suggest coldness where there had once been complexity. Video clips were edited with surgical cruelty, moments of tension isolated and replayed until they seemed definitive rather than fragmentary. A glance became a glare. A pause became indifference. The media did not ask whether these fragments told the truth, it asked whether they told a story that could be sold. And the story that sold best was one of betrayal within bloodlines, of a powerful sister exerting pressure, until the weaker one broke. In this version of events, nuance was an inconvenience, and grief itself became suspect if it interfered with the momentum of blame. Brooke found herself entombed within this narrative almost overnight. The shock of Katie's death had barely begun to register when it was eclipsed by the sensation of being watched, judged, and condemned by strangers who spoke with absolute certainty about moments they had never lived. She moved through her days as though encased in glass, visible from all sides yet unreachable, her expressions dissected and her silences interpreted as confession. Grief, once a private and sacred experience, was transformed into evidence. Any attempt to explain was framed as evasion. Any refusal to engage was read as arrogance. Brooke became trapped in a paradox where innocence required performance, and performance itself was proof of guilt. The cruelest aspect of the accusation was not that it came from outside the family, but that it infected the spaces where grief should have been safest. Donna existed at the center of this fracture, suspended between loyalty and doubt, between the sister she had lost and the sister now under siege. She carried memories of both women, memories that refused to align with the simplified narrative being imposed upon them. She remembered Katie's stubborn resolve, her insistence on bearing the weight of her choices alone. She also remembered Brooke's frustration, born not of malice but of fear that pride would become a weapon turned inward. Yet memory proved fragile against repetition. As accusations echoed louder, even Donna felt uncertainty creep in, not because she believed Brooke capable of such harm, but because doubt thrives in silence and grief offers no stable ground. The name Logan, once a source of cohesion, began to rot under the pressure of public scrutiny. What had symbolized resilience and endurance was rebranded as evidence of internal warfare. The family name became shorthand for dysfunction, invoked with a mixture of fascination and contempt. To carry it now was to inherit suspicion, to be associated not with legacy but with blame. Brooke felt this transformation acutely, as though the name she had defended for decades had turned against her, reshaping itself into a mark of disgrace. The irony was unbearable. The very identity she had fought to protect had become the instrument of her public undoing. As the weeks passed, the intensity of the condemnation did not fade, it sharpened. Brooke's guilt, whether genuine or imposed, calcified into something inescapable. She replayed her last interactions with Katie endlessly, searching for moments she might have softened, words she might have withheld. The knowledge that she had loved her sister fiercely offered no relief, because love did not negate impact. The question that haunted her was not whether she intended harm, but whether intention mattered in the face of outcome. In the court of public opinion, consequences eclipsed motives, and the finality of death rendered all defenses irrelevant. Donna watched this transformation with mounting despair, aware that the family was being reshaped by forces none of them could control. She felt the pressure to choose a side, to either defend Brooke unequivocally, or align herself with the narrative of accountability that dominated every conversation. Neutrality was treated as complicity. Silence was interpreted as agreement. Donna's own grief became distorted, weaponized against her, as though mourning required allegiance rather than honesty. She found herself mourning not only Katie, but the version of her family that had once existed before grief became spectacle. The tragedy of Katie's death was compounded by the way it was consumed. Her life, her agency, her choices were flattened into a cautionary tale designed to satisfy outrage rather than understanding. She was no longer remembered as a woman who fought relentlessly for self-definition, but as a victim whose death required a culprit. In that reframing, Brooke's humanity was collateral damage, sacrificed to preserve a narrative that allowed the public to feel righteous rather than uncertain. The need for moral clarity outweighed the discomfort of ambiguity, and so guilt was assigned where explanation would have demanded patience. In the end, the most devastating consequence of this collective judgment was not Brooke's isolation, or Donna's divided loyalty, but the realization that the truth had become irrelevant. The complexity of sisterhood, the interplay of love and conflict, the inevitability of regret in relationships defined by intensity, none of it mattered against the simplicity of blame. The name Logan, stripped of its history, was reduced to a headline, a curse passed from one generation to the next. And in that transformation, the family lost not only Katie, but the right to grieve her honestly, unburdened by the demand to assign fault where tragedy alone might have sufficed. What remained was a silence heavier than accusation, a recognition that some losses are made unbearable not by death itself, but by the stories told afterward. Brooke carried that weight with her, knowing that redemption in the public eye might never come, that the narrative had already been written and archived. Donna carried it too, in quieter ways, holding together fragments of memory that refused to conform to condemnation. And somewhere within that fractured legacy, Katie's absence echoed as a warning about the cost of turning grief into spectacle, and names into weapons. Long after the heart that bore them has stopped beating, the funeral was supposed to be the final punctuation mark, the moment when grief was allowed to settle into silence and the living were granted permission to breathe again. The rituals were familiar, almost comforting in their predictability, the carefully arranged flowers, and solemn faces offering the illusion of closure. For a few hours, even a world as relentlessly dramatic as the bold and the beautiful seemed to pause, as though acknowledging that some losses demanded reverence rather than spectacle. Katie's name was spoken with reverence, her life summarized in phrases designed to soothe rather than interrogate. Yet beneath that fragile calm, something restless stirred, an unspoken awareness that this story, like so many before it, would not be permitted to end with tears alone. The disruption came with cruel precision. On the very day meant to honor Katie's memory, fragments of another truth surfaced, cutting through the mourning like a blade through silk. It was not announced with ceremony, nor did it arrive as a complete revelation. Instead, it emerged in pieces, whispered confirmations and sudden connections that forced those closest to her to reevaluate everything they thought they understood. The information revolved around Luna and Will, or more accurately, around the consequences of that entanglement, consequences Katie had quietly absorbed without ever revealing their full weight. As the fragments aligned, it became clear that Katie had carried more than grief to her grave. She had carried knowledge, and she had chosen silence as a form of protection. The realization struck with devastating clarity. Katie had known far more than she ever admitted, had understood the danger lurking beneath the surface long before it became visible to anyone else. Her decisions, once dismissed as stubbornness or pride, now revealed themselves as calculated acts of shielding, attempts to contain a threat she believed could destroy her child if exposed too soon. In death, her silence transformed from mystery into sacrifice. She had not been merely a woman caught in the crossfire of family conflict. She had been a guardian standing between her son and a truth too volatile to unleash. Will's reaction to this knowledge was immediate and violent in its intensity, though the violence turned inward rather than outward. The weight of responsibility crashed down on him with a force he was unprepared to withstand. The idea that his mother had died carrying a burden meant to protect him shattered any remaining sense of innocence. Grief twisted into self-loathing, love into accusation, as he replayed his choices endlessly, searching for the moment when he could have altered the outcome. The knowledge that Katie's heart had failed under the strain of secrets she bore for his sake ignited a consuming guilt. To Will, her death ceased to be a tragic inevitability, and became a consequence, one he could not escape no matter how fiercely he denied it. That guilt drove him to the edge of reason. He oscillated between denial and obsession, desperate to undo a past that no longer existed. Every memory of his mother became contaminated by the question of what she had withheld, how long she had endured in silence, and whether her restraint had been an act of love, or a fatal miscalculation. The line between victim and cause blurred in his mind until he could no longer distinguish where responsibility truly lay. His grief did not soften with time, it sharpened, evolving into a volatile mix of rage and despair that left him unmoored, searching for something tangible to blame. Bill's response unfolded along a different trajectory, but it was no less dangerous. Where Will turned inward, Bill turned outward, his grief crystallizing into a singular purpose: retribution. The revelation that Katie had died protecting their child reframed his understanding of loss into something intolerable. Grief, for him, demanded action, demanded an enemy upon whom it could be unleashed. The world had already offered him a convenient target in the form of public scapegoats and manufactured villains, but Bill sensed that these explanations were insufficient. The true crime, as he saw it, lay not in overt conflict, but in manipulation, in the unseen hands that orchestrated suffering while remaining invisible. Brooke, standing amid this unraveling, experienced a reckoning of her own. The blame that had been heaped upon her in the wake of Katie's death began to feel almost trivial in comparison to the emerging truth. The so-called war over the Logan name, once perceived as the central tragedy, now appeared painfully superficial. Brooke understood, with dawning horror, that their conflict had served as a distraction, a spectacle that diverted attention from a far more insidious reality. The real enemy had never fought in the open. The true manipulator had operated in shadows, timing each revelation for maximum devastation, ensuring that grief and blame would fracture the family from within. This realization transformed Brooke's guilt into something more complex and more terrifying. She saw now how easily emotions could be weaponized, how pride and resentment could be guided towards self-destruction, while the architect of chaos remained untouched. Katie's death, Will's unraveling, Bill's thirst for vengeance, all of it fit into a pattern that suggested intent rather than coincidence. Brooke recognized that the timing of the revelation, unveiled precisely when defenses were lowered and hearts were raw, was not accidental. It was strategic, designed to ensure that mourning would turn into madness before clarity could emerge. The funeral, meant to be a place of closure, thus became a catalyst for collapse. Instead of uniting the family in shared loss, it exposed the fault lines beneath their relationships, widening them beyond repair. The atmosphere shifted from sorrow to suspicion, from remembrance to reckoning. Katie's legacy, once framed as a symbol of resilience, became a battleground for competing interpretations of her silence. Was she a victim of circumstance, or a conscious participant in a dangerous game of concealment? The answer depended on who was asking, and on what they needed her memory to justify. As the truth continued to surface, it became increasingly clear that Katie's final act had been one of profound loneliness. She had chosen to bear knowledge alone, believing that containment was safer than confrontation. In doing so, she underestimated the ruthlessness of those who thrived on delayed revelation. Her silence, intended as protection, became the very mechanism through which devastation was amplified. The manipulator, whoever they truly were, had understood this dynamic perfectly, exploiting the human tendency to equate silence with safety. In the aftermath, each member of the family was left to navigate a different form of ruin. Will grappled with the unbearable notion that love could kill as surely as hatred. Bill sharpened his grief into a weapon, convinced that only destruction could restore balance. Brooke stood at the intersection of these forces, burdened by the knowledge that her earlier battles had obscured the real threat. She understood now that names, legacies, and public wars were tools easily repurposed by those who understood timing better than morality. The funeral's flowers wilted, the crowd dispersed, and yet nothing felt finished. Katie's absence lingered not as peace, but as an open wound, a reminder that the most dangerous truths are not those spoken aloud, but those withheld until it is too late to respond. In that realization lay the cruelest lesson of all, that grief does not end a story, it only strips away the illusions that once made it bearable. And as the family stood on the edge of what came next, one truth became unavoidable. The war they thought they had been fighting was never the real one. The true battle had always belonged to someone else, someone patient enough to wait for the moment when tears would blind everyone to the hand pulling the strings.